Okay, hi everybody. And this is Monica Richardson here. And today we have with us Joe Miller, who is the author of this book. I will put the link down below, and it's called The US of AA, How the 12 Steps Hijacked the Science of Alcoholism. And I am just so happy to have you here today, but that you wrote this book, that you were compelled to write this book. I know it took you 5 long years to do it. And we did a podcast, but it seems like people really want to see people now, and they really want to do in-depth. There's so much watching on YouTube of people. So without any further, let's just get right into it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So what compelled you to say, oh, I mean, that's quite a thing to write a book. It's like making a film.
Yeah, well, it started out initially to be kind of a memoir. I was going to write about sort of recovering from recovery. But in the process of that, I just kept digging more and more into the history of AA and finding it to be just a fascinating story. Not only because it's outrageous, as far as what happened, but because it's a good story. There's some really interesting characters in it, and interesting drama, and just moved in that direction more. There's some memoir aspect to it in the introduction, and but mostly it's a history. I wanted to tell it like a story. I think that was the other thing is I as a journalist, I really specialize in telling stories. I like the form of stories. I think they're a really powerful way to get across messages. And I thought that telling this story would give a different perspective. There are a lot of books out there criticizing AA and that sort of thing, and this would give a different perspective on sort of how it all came to be.
Yeah, and the other thing that a lot of us like about the book is that it's an easy read. So there are books like even Lance Doty's book is an easy read. Like you guys are professors, right? You're a professor, correct? And a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Highly educated. And yet you didn't make this book is like I blasted through this. And that's one of the things, if you're out there and looking for a really good book that is the historic count of AA, and even some things in other historical books that were left out that you put in here, which we're going to get into. That I found myself plowing through it, and in 3 days I had read it, but yet I went back and sort of wanted to study it. And one of the things that, go ahead, what's that?
Find it here, because I really strive to make things not only easy to read, but pleasant to read.
Yeah, it was. You did a really great job. Let me ask you this, because that was a couple of years ago. Did you ever do radio book tour or television book tour in the US with this book?
Not much. Honestly, the book did not get sort of the attention. I think some of the cult of AA sort of cast a bit of a negative on it, because it didn't get reviewed by anybody really, except for a couple of very, very small publications. The biggest I got was a New York Post. There was a big New York Post article about it.
Oh, really?
And
that's right. That's what, you know what, will you hold on? I think my gardener is here. Whoa, I gotta close 2 windows. I was like, well, what do you do? Just come on. Maybe, does this help? I don't know. I could text him too. Is that better? Can you hear that now or no?
I couldn't hear it before, no.
Oh, okay, so it's just me. It's just, it'll pass through. Okay, so you felt like the cult of the power of AA kind of squashed maybe where you could have been interviewed and stuff, probably.
Well, I guess what would I say, that there's just sort of a knee-jerk, like society, it's so ingrained in society that AA is the way, that I think that there's sort of an automatic kind of reflexive, disregard things that don't fit in with that truth, So it hasn't gotten the attention that I was hoping it would get, but it's still, if you look on Amazon, it's got a lot of really solid reviews, and
does it? Yeah.
And I did do a bit of a book tour. I did readings in Georgia and in Colorado, and got some local media And
But
of course, the recovery press, pretty much everybody looked into it, the Fix website and,
what'd they
point-
say? What did the pro AA people say about it? I'm gonna just
well, I
mention
wouldn't
my
call them
gardener.
necessarily pro AA, at least the people I talked to.
Mm,
They were quite open-minded and,
oh, good.
yeah, I haven't, what's funny is when my agent and I sent out the proposal, we sent it to a bunch of different publishers at the same time. And within hours of it going out, I got a random email from a stranger calling me an idiot,
Wow.
disputing the 12 steps and all that sort of thing. So obviously there was one of the editors that we sent it to was in AA or whatever and sent it to their little community. And
Oh,
so, but no,
yeah.
the Fix wrote good stuff about it. Had good interviews with them and with the Points blog. I can't remember. I think there was another. And then of course your podcast, and then there's another podcast called the Straight Truth or something like that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The right, is that the guy Jim Breslow? Were you on the Jim Breslow
Yeah,
guy?
that's right.
Yeah, he does good interviews. Did you do that virtually or were you able to be there with him?
Virtually.
Yeah, yeah. Shall we dive in? I mean, there's some really
Sure, yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Is there some place you'd like to begin? Because I have stuff highlighted. Is
Go
somebody
for it. It's
Okay.
really been a while since I've talked about it, so
Okay. So I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about is this is the crazy part about how AA is today. So we all know now that hallucinogens are actually curing alcohol use disorder, with the John Hopkins doing this study on psilocybin, which is funny because he used belladonna, which is a powerful hallucinogen, along with a sedative, right? I mean, that's really where he finally stopped. And then, but AA didn't continue with that, right? If they made this protocol, which they used, he actually used it. So it was not a white light. It wasn't a spiritual experience he was having, which, okay, you could have a spiritual so-called experience under the, mushrooms or psilocybin, right? That people are using journeys all the time now to cure. I know people who've done it and it's cured their drinking. But you talk about his beginnings, and he was in a hospital, he wasn't in some like fake rehab in somebody's house in a neighborhood. He went to there were hospitals back then that treated people who had alcohol issues of this depth, that he was a severe drunk, we would call it back then, right? Yeah. He didn't have a personality. He wasn't he didn't have the personality of alcoholic like they started doing, springing children from foster care and saying, oh, that's an issue. You know what I mean? Like the evolution's nuts. So let's say what did you discover about the beginnings that you think might be important?
Well, there is that point that the spiritual awakening that's at the center of the whole thing, and the whole movement and the tools of how it works and that sort of thing, is that it came from this flashpoint in this man's life. And yeah, he was under the influence of drugs and also going through DT's effect as well. Interesting thing, that's something that he continued throughout his life, and he actually had tension with his fellow members of AA around these other areas that he explored to try and deal with alcoholism. He was into LSD when it was still legal and was kind of an experimental thing that was going around in the 50s and 60s. He was into spiritualism, ghosts. They would do the Ouija board stuff and go into past lives and that kind of thing. And even something as innocuous as vitamin B12. He got really into vitamin B12, which we know can help with depression. And when he sent out a letter to physicians about it on AA letterhead, the fellowship went berserk, and forbid him to do that. So they're very narrowly focused on their way, and other avenues that were brought up by Bill Wilson. Other areas to explore were shut down as well.
Yeah, that's a whole story too. I mean, we're seeing that with at least John Hopkins, and out here in Santa Monica, the Pacific Brain Institute, my surgeon who did my brain surgery. So I had a meningioma tumor in 2012. It was non-cancerous, thank God. We had to open up and they took it out and I was fine. But when I went to see him right before COVID for my checkup, it was like, my 18-month checkup, he said, "Oh, you won't believe what I'm doing," because he knew about my film. He said, "We're doing this study with psilocybin." And I'm like, "What? You're doing what?" He goes, "Yeah, because they were dealing with traumatic brain injury as well. So the football players, so one of Dr. Barkadarian is also one of the surgeons there who worked on my surgery. And wait, it's like noisy. Stop it. The dog barking, and you got the blower guy. I'm like, I might have to just take a moment and go say, "Please stop the blowing." Yeah, so I think that my understanding too was that they wanted to separate themselves from Bill, right? Because as he was doing more and more, psychedelics, LSD, they wanted to raise, this gold standard of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was too much of it attached to the hippies, right? So it was like, oh, he did it for a long time, right? How long did he do LSD for?
Through the 60s.
Yeah, yeah. In curing his depression, correct?
With Aldous Huxley. I mean, there's one of the interesting things about this book is that I found that he was cool in his own way. He was connected to figures that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And yeah, to trip with Aldous Huxley, who of course wrote Brave New World, and
right.
It's one of the four thinkers in psychedelic thought. He was like buddies with him, tripping. It's just bizarre to me. It doesn't compute with like the AA kind of scene.
Right. Yeah. The
interesting thing with the dogma that he ran up against, that was part of it, but he also wanted to sort of revise the steps, and
really, I didn't know that.
Change some things in it, and met fierce resistance. But that's partly what that 12 and 12 book is. It was his attempt to sort of sharpen the steps that they had in the big book, the main text of Alcoholics Anonymous. But he wrote about that. He wrote about how difficult it was to go up against the dogma of the group. The dogma itself was a threat to their ability.
I think once you get ideology and then it spins its own yarn, and then but how Rehab influenced AA. With the dog, what is it that saying where the tail is wagging the dog, whatever. Yeah. You could see the influence of Rehab. Let's go though, where something that I found really fascinating, which was politics, and how deep and how soon and how long ago it got in. It's with the Hughes guy, correct? You want to?
Well, it begins before that. They were trying to get it. They were trying to get things going under the Kennedy administration as well, and it sort of made some inroads there. But yeah, it was this senator from Iowa, Harold Hughes, who was a recovering alcoholic, and was really on a kind of a short list for the presidency there for a while in the early 70s for running for the presidency as a Democrat. He is outspoken against the Vietnam War. But yeah, the push to get some political legislation around it began pretty early on with Marty Mann and her whole campaign to make America accept alcoholism as a disease rather than a moral problem, and that it needed a cure, and that the cure was AA. So she had a campaign that worked at not just the publicity level, but at the institutional level as well. They had people engaged in civic groups, people engaged in county level health organizations, hospitals, and then state level health organizations. And the first political bodies to recognize alcoholism as a disease were state legislatures that were lobbied by members of Marty Mann's group in AA. Wow. And yeah, that was just a long push to get basically an AA law on the books, all through the 60s, and of course finally getting passed through in the early 1970s. And that in itself is just kind of a crazy story, because it happened, the big push for it came under the Johnson administration. Johnson was very outspoken. He was actually the first president to call alcoholism a disease in a public speech. There was, of course, Hughes was a Democrat and LBJ was a Democrat, so there was cooperation there. But then when it finally passed through, Nixon was then president, and he was going to do a pocket veto on it, which is just don't sign it.
Hmm.
But his friend of his, a real close political ally, who was I forget the guy's name now, but he was the CEO of PepsiCo, of the
Oh,
Pepsi company.
wow.
And he was called by a man named oh boy, is it Smithers? It's been a couple of years. Can you remind me in the book who the rich guy was that Marty Mann connected with, who became sort of the benefactor for the whole campaign? It was
Oh,
Smithers?
the guy from IBM? Was it the IBM
Yeah,
guy? Or,
the heir of the IBM fortune.
yeah, so I have that, I'm sure I have that highlighted. Let's see if I can, and the whole CBS too. The guy for the VP for CBS also became he was on her board.
Yeah.
It was pretty shocking. That I learned here.
So this Brink, boy, I'm just drawing a blank on the name. He's got a
R.
big.
Brinkley, here it is. Here it is, Joe. It's R. Brinkley Smithers of the
That's
Smithers
right. So I was
Foundation.
right all along. R. Brinkley
Okay.
Smithers. So
Yeah, so you're
rich recovering alcoholic. He called his friend at PepsiCo, who he knew was close with Nixon, and got him to persuade Nixon to do it.
wow.
And part of the deal, what's weird is part of the deal got Pepsi into Russia in exchange for us, for the first time, getting Russian vodka into America. So isn't that crazy? And Russia wanted the Pepsi to try and avoid over drinking of vodka.
Wow.
So
That's nuts.
yeah.
Wow, that's so deep. And so when, even as you kind of talked about the senator, I mean, the Senate legislature, how it got in there, when I read her book, that I didn't really read it cover to cover, but I studied it for the film. And it was shocking how deep she got. And then the Hollywood component, which is really huge. So they have this mouthpiece that just is never ending.
Mhm.
Like another actor just, was on People magazine. Somebody posted in one of the Facebook groups today about how he is sober 8 years now. And his acting's become terrible now because, he's watching him, he's all self-conscious and he's all, I'm sober. And I'm like, this guy was a great actor. I forget his name right now because I don't really want to say it, but it's at a point where they have these like $1 million free campaigns of, oh, look, Joe Schmo is like a Scientologist. So, isn't this great? Like, or,
well, in the big Senate open meeting about the bill, where the press was all there, Mercedes McCabe testified, and she was a big Oscar-winning actress at the time. So
yeah, and Dick Van
they
Dyke,
had star
right?
power from the beginning.
Right. Was it? But I think the groundwork was really laid so deeply, like you just said, politically, and everybody who's in AA in the small way, like those of us like me, who was, went to these small meetings and thought and believed what was read when the traditions were read, that, oh, we're just these little pods and we're not involved in politics. And so no talking about politics, no talking about religion, which they kept all of the little people anonymous. The famous people, talked about it, and it's just so creepy because when I started making the film, if I would have understood how deep it was, I don't think I would have made it. I would have said, this is too hard. This Goliath is too big,
Well, thank goodness that you did.
Yeah, thank goodness I did, and thank goodness, thank you. And you wrote this book. So okay, so for everybody out there listening, what we just heard, Joe say is that this was many people. This guy knew Nixon and LBJ. Actually, there's a part in your book too about LBJ. Is it Lyndon B. Johnson and Marty Mann were friends? Didn't she go out there and like schmooze with him? How did that begin?
Well,
I don't remember
he was
that.
the early card-carrying member of her organization. Her organization had local committees all over the country, and there was one in Austin where Johnson was based. And at the time, he was a representative. He wasn't even in the Senate yet. And yeah, he became a card-carrying member of the group and they were the ones that were there to provide information at every drop of the hat about alcoholism to whomever in power
Wow.
may be. And yeah, as part of my research for the book, I actually visited the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in
Yeah.
Austin and read his staffs back and forth about the kind of bill they wanted to have. And then, of course, he gave a big State of the Union address. Well, he actually, one year he did the State of the Union address in a series of speeches to Congress about different themes, and one of them had alcoholism as part of it. And that's where he said alcoholism is a disease, which had never been stated by someone in power like that before.
Wow. So now a president decides what a disease is, right?
Yeah.
But you know what? I think that you really cover it in the book, because my recollection is that the two of them, right? There was Marty and there were two other people who I forget their name. And they were at it trying to get the Senate like 15 years prior to call it a disease or something so that insurance would cover it. Right. I mean, it took them a while and then they kind of gave up, right? Isn't that?
Yeah. Yeah. It took a, well, all through the 60s, they were pushing for this legislation that would call it a disease. And there would be certain champions in the House of Representatives, less so in the Senate. There was an early champion of it, a representative from Georgia, who I actually talked to some of his descendants. He's now passed away. So it kind of rose up through those ranks, and it meant resistance. I mean, there was, to a lot of the other members of the Congress that, thought that's just absurd. People choose to drink and that kind of thing. Along this argument is that at the same time, there was a Supreme Court decision about it, which is one of the most interesting ones that I know of in Supreme Court history. One is that it was a tie. There have been a number of non-majority decisions, like a handful. This is the only one I know of.
Right.
But it was 4-4-1 split.
Really?
4 of them were against the idea of it being a disease. 4 of them were solidly for it. And then the 5th said, I think it's a disease, but I don't agree with this law. With this. So, and that actually has become, from what I understand, I'm no legal expert, but from what I understand, if you're getting into criminal liability law, that this particular decision is a really important one.
Really? Why is that? Why is that?
Because it gets to the issue of will and choice. So the case was a guy who was a chronic drunk in Texas, and Texas had pretty strong anti-drunk and public laws. And he was constantly being arrested, and he couldn't get out of jail because he could never pay for the bail or anything like that. So the ACLU took on the case, arguing that he has a disease and it's cruel and inhumane punishment to punish someone for having a disease. Right? And what it finally came down to by a narrow majority was, the narrow majority of 5 said, yes, it's a disease, but one of them said, but he still had a choice about whether or not to be in public. So it's an interesting decision from a liability perspective, because if you open that precedent where because you have a disease of alcoholism, you don't have control and you can't be punished for the choices you make. Well, that's really opening the door. At what point do you draw the line?
Oh my God, that's terrible. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, we do know that. So but what year was that?
66.
I mean, I have somebody that I know who lives in Long Island, and they had a child who was in their 20s, and they were all driving and they were drinking together and they killed somebody. It was accidental. He was drunk. Now, he wasn't an alcoholic. He wasn't somebody who really suffered from alcohol use disorder like Bill Wilson. He was a stupid kid who drove drunk. And the judge said to him, you're going to serve time, which I do think if you kill somebody, I think you should serve time, even drunk. I don't think that you should just be able to go to a rehab, forced, a prison paid, there's these pipelines, right? They're not even in prison, right? They're deferment, or not deferment, but you know what I mean? They're these, they get sent with normal people. Anyway, they go these rehabs instead of going to prison. especially if someone is continually drinking and driving, right, and not stopping.
Mhm.
But it's, yeah, it's really, so he did 3 years in prison. I know a lot of people that get sent to prison. So I think maybe that people forgot about that
Mhm.
case, but you bring up a really interesting point
Well, I
about
think it's because
powerlessness.
of the precedent that they made the case that way, that it didn't open the door to that. So now people are still largely held accountable for their actions and their choices
Mm,
in this regard. It's a really interesting decision because I don't know how much you're into the Supreme Court, but this was the Warren Court, which was the really liberal, historically known as really liberal, Brown versus Board of Education and Roe versus Wade and all these
right.
really big decisions that conservatives today are really, well, I don't know about Brown versus Board, but Roe. And it's interesting because Warren actually talked Thurgood Marshall into being against the idea of it being a disease. So it's
Oh,
just
really?
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it. Like I did watch the Thurgood Marshall movie, and the one about with the cute little what's her name, the little tiny judge. No, I'm
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I did watch it because I like learning about history if it's well done. I thought the Thurgood Marshall was amazing. Like if you want to see about overcoming adversity, I mean anybody of any color, you should watch that film or read his story. I think it's an amazing story. But I would say that in my life at that point, no, I had like no interest. I just was interested in women's reproductive rights, and we see how things have changed, and my own opinions have changed over the years. And after especially what we've been through in the last 2 years.
Yeah, no
Uh,
kidding.
but I found it really frightening how deep this had gotten. I went to San Antonio. I got into a film festival. I was super excited. I went to my film showed in this big theater, and I was like, wow, like probably people want to throw darts at me, and sometimes I'd be like fearing for my life, and and then other times, I would feel okay. But this woman got up, and she was like the sheriff of the town, or the police chief, and she was like bragging. There was another movie, it was really good documentary showing how to help prisoners turn around their lives and not just lock them up, and it was a good story. But there was a thread of AA that they didn't really say it, but I was like, this smells of 12-step stuff anyway, because I brought meetings into prison. And then she stands up, instead of just talking about things in general, she goes, well, I'm a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have 25. I was like, dude, like, who cares? Like, you're like, it's not a badge. It means you were once a drunk, or you were once like, I don't like to use those words, but like with them, when they're so arrogant and they're like, I'm better than you. Look at me.
Mhm.
I haven't had a
Yeah.
drink in 25 years. Like the level of arrogance that not all stars, but there's plenty of famous people that are really arrogant about their time. And all of us, like people like me, who was in it for like 30 something years, we all know about the status and about the browbeating, and I'm better than you, even though they say it doesn't matter. No, it does matter. If you sit in there long enough, they are so full of shit about like that they think they're better. And what I see as being gone now for so long is that they have really gone so far away from whatever the beginning was, which if somebody was drinking like Bill and those other guys and those other women, that is so sad and so serious. And when they have 100 days, that's a big freaking deal. That's a
Mhm.
lot of time to not drink a drop.
Mhm.
And then when they get to a year, that's a really long time. And what
Mhm.
AA does now is they diminish that. It's like, oh, well, you're really not really sober. Like we have one guy just joined the group, and he said because he wasn't working the steps in the right way, he wasn't really sober.
Mhm.
It's,
Yeah, I've heard that too.
I have, and I'm going to do another post about the growth of the exodus of AA during COVID, which I'll do another time. But
Hmm.
let's go on here so she created something, the National Council on Alcoholism and Education, right? The first
Mhm.
Marty Mann did. We talk a little bit about Marty and that and how it, grew.
Yeah, well, so Marty, fascinating character, closeted lesbian, really kind of hooked into the New York culture scene, Her boyfriend, her girlfriend was an art director for Vogue magazine, and they had Jackson Pollocks and Mark Rothko's that they bought for nothing, before anybody knew about them. So they're really cool. And
Wow.
she was very savvy, very, very savvy public relations, really a genius at it.
Yep.
And yeah, she kind of dreamed this whole thing up. It was partly based on the work that Dorothea Dix, is it?
Her girlfriend's name?
No, work that was done before her around the area of a different illness. It might have been tuberculosis.
Oh, yeah. It is
So she
TB,
was
right?
inspired by that, and she had, at the time when she first got sober, she became kind of a spokesperson for the organization, going around to different civic groups in New York because she was such a good speaker and
Yeah.
had presence. And she kind of dreamed up this whole national campaign that would be those kinds of activities, but in a multi-pronged approach, at community level, the health community level, the business community level, the press, entertainment, and politics. And all to kind of get out this idea that AA is the way to go, AA is at the center of it. And at first, she had a hard time getting funding for it, but almost by luck, she hooked up with some people at Yale. It was led by a guy named Howard. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Howard Haggard, who was kind of a popular scientist at the time. He would write some kind of books that would be a little bit popular and kind of get news. And he was interested in getting, well, there was a whole push in the science community in general to try and steer America away from prohibition. So prohibition ends in 1934. And initially the rollout of re-legalization of alcohol did not go very well. So there was a real upswell to bring prohibition back. It was a real concern.
Oh, really?
The New York Times even opined at one point that they felt that the prohibition was going to come back. So the science community thought, okay, well, we can kind of take the lead here and provide good science about alcohol, and then we won't make decisions about alcoholism based on, passions and religion and that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
So he developed a lab at Yale around alcohol, and they were having a hard time getting funding too. So one of the people that worked there, whose name was Bunky Jelinek, Elwin Jelinek, who was from Hungary, another odd character. He connected with Marty Mann and immediately seized on it as this is the great idea that we need to be able to fund our research, is to get this popular message out about alcoholism. Because at the time, everybody was kind of like, if you think about it, coming out of the prohibition, like everybody's tired of this whole debate and their opinions locked in and that sort of stuff. So there wasn't, the philanthropic community was not interested in it, and there were no government grant mechanisms at all for alcoholism at that time. So they seized on this as we need to back this PR campaign, and they backed her for the first 5 years financially, but more importantly, scientifically. She was able to go out and say, I'm with Yale, and I'm telling you that it's a science, this is science, that this is a disease and that sort of thing. And Yale was giving no such proof. In fact, they had at that time, an idea of alcoholism that's more in line with what's emerging now, which is this, or has been emerging for the past 20 years, which is more of a multi-pronged approach to dealing with alcoholism. That, AA is right for some, but for others, it's a mix of medication and therapy and, exercise even, and, and in some cases, psychedelic
and plant-based medicine. I mean, LSD that's not for this, but psilocybin, which is much more mild, they're proven. So I think it's interesting that he went on to, he used a lot of LSD, but belladonna is different, right? So, but the psilocybin is curing it. It just takes more than one journey. It can be 3 journeys, but the science is there. And but back to this, when I was looking at her black and white, her talking, and that we stuck in my film, and I'm like, where is she talking? Like, who is she doing these talks to? And then you could see the little emblem, and it was the Rotary clubs.
Oh yeah, cute, or like
all over, right?
Women to speak at the Detroit Business Club, I think, which is a big big deal policy making kind of deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she mounted this campaign. At first Yale backed it, then they split, and for a while they almost fell apart. They were barely holding it together, and then they lucked out and got this Art Brinkley Smithers guy to just bankroll everything all through the 50s and 60s. And then with the passing of the legislation in the 70s, and of course it became institutionalized, and millions of federal dollars went into her into a program that was modeled off after her. And initially, well, it created the NIAAA, right? The National Institute of Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse, which is now. And in the first few years of it, most of that money went toward PR. Most of it went toward putting out this message of going to AA for cure, and not as much was put into science. Subsequent administrations, starting with the Carter administration, moved it more towards science. So now they're kind of on the opposite side. They've got all this great science that shows there are 100 different ways to approach your alcohol problem, but they don't have the PR to counterbalance the PR that was done before. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And also the head of NIDA, I don't know if Nora Volcro is still it, but I heard her when I was trying to find out, like, where is this? How deep is it? She, I heard her give a talk, and she went off on this tangent, talking about a brain disease and it's not changeable. And I think it's when I went through my own brain surgery experience, when my surgeons were like, no, the brain is very plastic, and very, like, if you have a stroke, like the brain will reassign other parts of the brain. So it's like, well, if a stroke, somebody can have some interesting things of recovery with that. I think that if someone actually stopped drinking or using drugs completely, that the brain, we're not talking about someone who's drinking 40 years, like the old drunks sitting outside a Soho or something they were called back then, right? Where they have wet brain. We're not talking about that the brain will change. But here we have, in today's world, like when I was almost done with the film, like trying to see, I would find new stuff that she was like standing there calling it a brain disease, which it's not. And then, and talking about her own father's drinking and personalizing it and not talking about science. And she's at the top. So I was like, oh, okay, here's a problem.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And Marty, yeah, was National Council of Alcoholism and Education, the National Council of Alcoholism and Drug Dependency. She kept reinventing herself. And then because I knew the guy who ran AA in New York, this is when I was still in it, so people would talk to you freely, is that even the other group, right? So there's another one that's the government, like that it's a government. So the NIAAD, triple is Marty's thing. NIDA is NIDA, National Institute of Drug Addiction. Is that NIDA?
That's the drug wing. There's two. There's one that's alcohol and there's one that's drugs. There's NIDA and then there's the NIAAA.
The NIAAA is right.
Marty helped shape, and she was on the board of it, and initially the advisory board for the first probably 7-8 years.
Right, and then they did get rid of her, though, right? They didn't want her on the board anymore. Is that what happened?
I don't remember it quite like that. I think she just moved on naturally. But yeah, early in the Carter administration, the organization had some scandal issues. They were taking advertising execs on junkets to Alaska and stuff like that, and there was a lot of funny business in their books and that sort of thing. So the Carter administration started really cracking down on them, and then during the Reagan administration was when it really made the shift to science.
And what about Bush, the older Bush?
It was like Yahoo! Look, I mean, the money was huge, and at first Nixon like tried to not spend it.
Yeah.
He did that with a bunch of stuff because he had a Democrat-controlled Congress, so they were passing stuff left and right that he didn't want. So he tried to not fund it, which he can't do. And so eventually he lost in court, and all those funds became immediately available. So like this huge backup. So they had millions for ad campaigns, millions.
Wow.
That had never, and that's where it really, that sort of laid the groundwork for the huge 12-step explosion of popularity in the late 80s and 90s. And Yeah, so now, I mean, it's a great organization. They dispense millions of dollars for very important research and are making incredible discoveries, but nobody knows about
Really?
it. Nobody know,
Really?
everybody believes the myth that Marty Mann pushed. She was so successful at PR that it's just embedded in our minds, our societal mind, kind of.
So you would say that the NIAAA does, like, if I would, interview them and the scientists there, that they would have really good information?
They would have really good information, but you will find a really interesting kind of catch-22. I don't know if catch-22 is the right term. Officially, in science talk, papers, conferences, and that kind of thing,
Yeah,
they'll acknowledge the criticisms of AA, But if you talk publicly with any of them, there's this big fear, I don't know how to put this, of cutting down, of belittling AA, because it does help people. There are certain people that it works really well for. I think maybe that's why, but it's interesting. Like, I could never, even with people that I've read their papers that they had written years ago, they were sharply critical. When I'd go on the record with them, they would not, because, well, here's the other thing, is like, part of the way AA works is on a lie a little bit. And that is, that you have to believe that you have a disease, and that if you drink anything, you're going to drink until you die, basically. You have to believe that you can't have that drink.
right.
So anything that undermines that, that says otherwise, undermines it. So people in the professional world, from my experience, were really careful about not, basically, almost like when grown-ups talk among each other and there's a kid in the room and you pretend like Santa Claus is still alive, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Or not still alive, but exists,
Yeah,
kind of like that. It's like there's this whole population that they know is
right.
sober based on believing in Santa Claus. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
that's a good simple point. But it's absolutely really true, when you see yeah, that's a good analogy.
thank you.
It's really a tough one. When we tried to organize, and we were organizing this summer on Facebook in a very specific group that say we're not going to just be, venting and stuff, that this is not a support group, this is an action group. And what would we need to do to change the narrative, to have other people understand, that there's all this other way to get help. And it was like 2 pages of like bullet, like it was all of this, which you said in the opening of this interview, of how deep and where you'd have to do it and stuff. And I mean, we did come with that. You have to tarnish the name. You have to tarnish the name of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there is similarities with the church and with the Boy Scouts. So the church, I was raised Catholic in New York City, and I loved going to church, loved all that stuff. But the church was not touchable for a very long time. Oh, no, 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 no. And there was censorship. People forget it, on television. Ricky and Lucy in separate beds. They couldn't say this, they couldn't say that, they couldn't say the word pregnancy. Now it's like porn, if you watch HBO. But, there was once a time, how dare you ever say anything bad about the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts as well. So I do think we have hope that if, say there's, thousands of people leaving, but only a certain amount will criticize it. Well, you know what? There's YouTube now. And I don't have to wait for the New York Times to come calling, or someone else. And Gabrielle Glaser, boy, she got death threats. Like, people just hated when she would write her articles and, wrote her book. How dare you? And see, you tell your own story. You had your own story. So you had an issue and then you went there. You want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, we don't have to talk about it at all, but that you are
Sure.
inside.
I mean, that was part of the impetus for it, was that I spent all this time in AA. I went in and out. I kept going back to it because I didn't know that there was any other choice. I kept being told that I had to go do this and it's my fault, I'm failing it, and all this sort of stuff. And then it was, 20 years into this whole back and forth, that I learned that for more than a decade, there had been medicine on the market that could help.
Yes.
I had no idea. I didn't know about this at all.
I know. There's no PR.
Yeah. So I had a hard time finding a doctor that would prescribe it, that would work with it, because the mindset of AA is so ingrained in all levels of the community.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
interesting.
so, when I took it and it helped.
Mhm.
It kind of, I like to describe it as it sort of punched a hole in my madness, and that I started drinking. I drank less. Like on nights when I would drink numerably less.
Was it
Fewer.
naltrexone? Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, naltrexone.
And
Yeah.
it was just, that was kind of the first step in, but as part of a multi-pronged approach, as
Yeah.
for exercise,
Mhm.
uh, you know, uh, cognitive therapy, behavior type techniques and that sort of thing. So that blew my mind. Like here I am, a pretty well-connected, smart guy,
Yeah.
that I would have this problem and go to professionals and not hear for 20 years
Yeah.
that there are these other options available, to be continually told I had to go to AA.
Wow.
That really,
That's,
that was
that's
part of
yeah,
the impetus for the
that's
story.
sad. I mean, a lot of people died, probably then. How long ago, Joe, was that you
Well, I
found?
first went in 1988, um, and I was in for about 8 years the first time. Came back in 2000, was for about 7 years. And
Oh,
then sometime a couple years after that, I was in for a couple years. And then it was around after that last time that I got wind that there were other ways.
right. So what year was that? Like, that's a long time. So you really
Probably
do.
about 2011.
Yeah. But I got to plug my computer in. I'm getting a little, I got to plug it in. I did this for. So, being on the road. There we go. And I'm plugged in. So 2011, and that's kind of when, well, I'm not sure when Claudia Christian, began her C3 Foundation. She's done tremendous work with the Sinclair Method. I'm going to see if she'll do an interview. So that's fantastic. I'm going to talk about I had marked it here. Hazelton. I'm going to talk about how big the rehab business is and got. And people in AA like to think that it's so separate. And here was this part about Kemper Insurance. That was the one where 1 billion subsidy via the NIAAA. The field was enjoying capital influx from the private sector as well, with more insurers following Kemper's insurance lead, offering treatment services to their clients. We're going to talk a little bit about the treatment industry. We didn't really, like 10
Well,
minutes.
there's a lot to dig into there. Yeah, really, it came out of Hazelton. It was a Minnesota thing. A guy who got sober up there, started spreading the word around, and some social workers started to take notice that some of their longtime struggling clients were coming in and suddenly were doing all right. And they discovered this AA thing was going on and sought to institutionalize it. So initially they got a building in the Minneapolis area that was kind of a recovery center, and then they bought this property in the countryside, which is now Hazelton. And through networking, sort of spread their message. They'd go to conferences and they'd talk about how it worked and that sort of thing. But there were some interesting twists that had to happen for it to work.
Mm-hmm.
One is, and this was early on in Minnesota, and as I would assume there is in most states, there's public jobs, public official jobs. They have rankings of certain kinds, and like if you have a certain education level, you can fill this job.
Mm-hmm.
So health workers had to have a certain education level. Counselors had to have a certain education level. Well, this new model of recovery, the experts in the field of, educated folks are not the experts. The experts are the people who've been through it, right? The former
Right.
drunks.
Right.
So they changed their laws to create a new designation that didn't require any education at all. It
Right.
just required some time of sobriety.
Yeah.
So that opened the gates to be able to, create these things and employ people pretty cheaply. You know what I mean? Like, because they're not
Right.
educated.
You-
And
yeah.
it's cheap. I mean, it's not like you're
Yeah.
putting people on through a CAT scan every day, or, giving them enormous amounts of drugs. They're like, they occupy a bed, and you pay this counselor to talk with them, and maybe, there's some aspirin involved or something like that, but it's
Right.
not, it's a way to make money,
Yeah, it's big money making because they pay people so cheaply
Mhm.
in those cheap rehabs, right? So that last week they were a client. I mean, this is very true in Rehab Riviera in California or Florida, right? Where, the laws are even looser here. And it's funny, this is where these big amounts of these places are. But, it's, they are in rehab, they go through rehab, and then they become the driver of the van, and then they become the helper in the cook plate, in the kitchen, and then they're like running a group, and then now they're a counselor, and now they're an expert. And
Yeah, in a lot of cases, they're overworked and stressed, and
yeah,
there are lots of cases where they'll go back out to drinking and hide it and keep their job going, overworked. A lot of times these organizations will, really push for the bottom line and overwork them. And so, yeah. And then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, insurance companies were really paying for it a lot. It isn't as much the case now. The other thing about this model of recovery is it's so perfect for them. It's a great business model to go in, because all the blame is on the client or on the patient.
right.
If it doesn't work, it's not the fault of the recovery center, according to their models. It's because he didn't work it hard enough and didn't want it enough,
Yeah, that's really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the part. I was working on a film before COVID about exposing that, of how bad rehab is and what are other options, and did a lot of filming, went to Florida, and it was really, really heartbreaking, and met people who were whistleblowers who told me how they were giving them drugs to reignite their insurance. So when they came out, so they were, their 30 days were up, and they were like, well, okay, you got to test positive again.
Wow. That's terrible. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, and so I've been, really debating with how to get that stuff out there without making a whole film again. And, I know anyway, it's, I guess that's why I can't stop, because there's like an ebb and flow to it, where you came along, it seemed where things were like quiet, and nobody was really being active or an activist about it. And then your book came out, and I was like, wow, like this is really a good book. It's like each book that has come out like this, and there really aren't a lot of them, because you did a lot of research. It's not just, oh, I went through it, like if I wrote one, it'd be really different. You have all this factual stuff. And I think Lance Doty's book is like that. It was a thin book, easy to read.
And probably I'm really impressed with Gabrielle Glazer's book. I just thought that fantastic.
Yeah. And her book, yes.
Her part about the sexual harassment in the group was just riveting and devastating.
Yeah, it was very powerful. Yeah, he began that. And so I feel like, we're close to an hour here. And it's so funny that nowadays, like, man, these people like Joe Rogan and these young people, they talk for like 2.5 hours on YouTube. It's no longer, okay, 3 minutes. In the old days, it was like, Monica, videos have to be short and people don't have an attention span. I'm like, no, there's going to be a thing that's going to come along called COVID. There's going to be all these closures. They're going to be sitting around, and they're going to turn off the mainstream news. And where are they going to go? They're going to go to YouTube. And I can't believe how people, will just go on. And I finally said, I don't care what this looks like, what I look like here, because the Zoom really has helped get the word out, So I would love to do, maybe a couple more.
Sure. I'd be happy to anytime you have me on, Monica. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, it's really, really good to talk to you. Again, if everybody out there, I'm going to put the link down in the bottom. This will get posted up pretty quickly. Again, we're talking to Joe Miller here, and this is the US of AA, how the 12 steps hijacked the science of alcoholism. And I got to tell you guys, like, if you are interested in seeing, I think you have to, if interested in seeing the history of how they became so big and so powerful and so entrenched, this book really says it all. And what I think it's important that if you're going to undo something and change something, you need to know your enemy. And I know you don't feel that way about it, but a lot of us do. That it's almost like, what did Dave Chappelle say? He said something like really funny about how, oh yeah, how'd they get so far? You know, so fast, you know, we're still trying to make inroads. I said, they got into government, dude.
Mm-hmm.
And half of them are probably steppers.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know I'm right because we have a governor of Texas was once an outed AA member, like she outed herself. She ran on that platform. You know, the mayor of Boston, he was at the Democratic National Convention in 2016 and said, I'm so-and-so Marty and I'm an alcoholic. And we're like, what? Do it. That's how, Dave. That's how they did it. They did it by getting into government and those positions, and they used whatever they had to get people to feel sorry for them and then say, look how good Johnny is. And you know what I think, in wrapping this up, it's really scary. I see another thing of prohibition, another wave of doctor talking to me about what really is the size of a drink, how many ounces really. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. What'd you just say? My son's a bartender. I think I know what. I'm like 60 something. What are you talking to me about? I drink like 2 or 3 days a week, a couple of drinks. And you see, even in some of the shows like Dope Sick. Have you watched Dope Sick?
No, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's a limited series. And it's about the whole thing with the Purdue farmer and the opioid. And it has that, it has that smear of like 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, say no, just say no. And it's really, there's something really too, it's kind of, I'm not really saying what I mean to say, you know, I'm just, but I know that you get it.
I know what you're saying. Yeah, definitely in terms of
it's starting to
amount
feel.
that they say is a moderate amount, it seems to be shrinking all the time.
What's that?
The amount that they officially say is moderate appears to be shrinking.
Yes, that's the part that, oh, now you're like, if you drink this much, you have a problem. And I'm like, by whose standards? Like, what's going on here? Who's doing this? And you know, I think it was this in your book where you're the one who talked about that the alcohol industry loved AA.
Oh yeah.
Because now it's your fault, right? It's my fault. It's not booze. It's not demon rum.
Right.
Right. I thought that was wild. I thought that was like
wild. Yeah, and it makes total sense.
Yeah, that it's your fault. You're selfish, self-centered to the extreme. And if you just worked a better program, Joe and Monica, you know, like it's like these poor people who came in hardcore addicted. They're the ones that needed that kind of love and care that might have been there in the beginning. People like me who already quit. I was like, I'm done. I was done, right? That's who it works for. Someone who's already, the wife said, if you don't go, I'm leaving your ass. And then they're like, oh, I got to stop. And they stop.
Well, and that's where that to me is the most dangerous part, because the myth requires you to reach that level of misery.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be that way. All the science shows that you can practice harm reduction techniques. I feel like if I had been taught in college or even high school, you know, harm reduction type stuff as opposed to all or nothing.
You know what? That would be a good topic. You know what? I'm going to put some stuff down because the harm reduction part, let's talk about that the next time. And then I also found it interesting. I don't know enough about this, but the presidents, who did what, like it would be kind of cool. And maybe I could do some research starting with, I don't know, should we start with LBJ, right? And that
this all started under the first inklings of it were under the Eisenhower administration. That's when Marty Mann first started getting in touch with somebody in his cabinet. And then And
Who's
then
after Eisenhower? Kennedy, right?
Kennedy was after Eisenhower, and then
Yeah.
LBJ and LBJ pushed it, give it a huge push. And then Nixon was against it. Nixon hated it for two reasons. Well, a couple of reasons. I mean, one of them might be that he drank himself. He famously was drunk
Who
a
was?
lot. Nixon.
Oh,
in the
Nixon,
White
was he?
House. Yeah,
Ah,
during the Watergate time, he drank. He's a notorious lightweight. But yeah, he was against it because he hated anything that had anything to do with the Kennedys, and he hated psychology.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he liked to drink.
But so is it true? I was reading recently about Ethel Kennedy did some kind of LSD treatment to be cured. She had a drinking problem.
I hadn't heard that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of going, it's somewhere, it's somebody posted something about her. Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, it was really good seeing you and
Great talking to
talking to
you
you,
too.
and
Thanks a lot.
you're welcome. We'll do another show, maybe like in a month. We can just do another one. And
Okay.
all right. Thanks. Enjoy down there. And you're in South America or Central?
Yeah,
South America.
Uruguay, South America.
South America. All right. See, I don't know my geography right at this moment.
Well, it's a small country. It's easy to miss. It's very small.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you again so much for writing this book. There's so many ex-AM
Thank
members.
you so much for reading it and championing it. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, you really have helped a lot of us who were harmed by it in any way. And there's so many people that have read it and love it. So we'll see you again. We'll do another show. All right. Take care. Bye, everybody. Bye. Okay. Let me see how I can do this.